Hi, Mike.
Hi Vic, how you doing?
Good. I'm good. And how are you?
I've just had a very interesting couple of days dealing with banks and communicating with banks and trying to move stuff around in a bank online. Never been able to talk to somebody, and when you do try and talk to somebody, when it doesn't work online, you hang on the phone for 2 hours until someone picks it up and then says, "You've come through to the wrong department. I'll transfer you." So yesterday I had an instance through complicated, not really complicated things, that I had to move something around the bank. And it is quite straightforward, really. But because of the mechanisms and through social media and infrastructure and online and people that aren't connected with what you're doing, and they don't really care that much because they press the button at the end of the day or move you somewhere else. I spent 4 hours getting nowhere.
Yeah.
So I actually went into a branch this morning and saw a person and sat at a desk with a person that sorted it all out in half an hour. And I came home happy, if you like, in myself that it had been completed. Last night, I was so stressed out about the whole thing because you were like wading through mud.
Yeah.
And this sort of thing happens in all sections
Yeah.
of life now.
Well, this is why we thought we'd do a podcast about this,
Yeah.
because I'm sure that everyone will see this. It could be dealing with an insurance company, it could be dealing with a bank. In my case, it was dealing with a university trying to fill in a form, that at the end there was some app they wanted me to download that then wasn't compatible with the platform that I was using. And you think, well, because I didn't need to get that sorted out because they were asking me to do it, I just sent an email and said, "Sorry, you're going to have to sort this out, aren't you?" Because I'm not, you know. Um, Now there is something where when you look at this, you would think that a bank, this will probably happen actually, that will be their sales pitch, that you will be able to speak to somebody. You know this will
Yes.
come.
Yes.
But it's going to have to get to the point where people have got rid of all the high street banks and all the rest of it, and you will not be able to speak to someone in person.
Mm.
And to be honest, if they're dealing with money and they're dealing with your money, and you're paying them to deal with your money, you would think there'd be a better service, and there isn't. It's getting worse.
It's getting
But
worse and worse.
it's in every strata of things. Now, I don't, there's something within this which I think would, because obviously we're talking about creativity and all the rest of it, which seems to be going counter to what is obvious. Now, I mentioned to you Rory Sutherland,
Mm.
recently. So Rory Sutherland I think he's the vice chairman of Ogilvy, who are an advertising agency, very famous advertising agency, named after David Ogilvy, who was
Yes.
the sort of marketing genius. And because Rory Sutherland's YouTube and TED Talks are not only incredibly clever, but they're extremely funny. And the point about it is that he was saying, and again, this sort of chimes with what I've been saying, that you can create something that is entirely logical and it doesn't work. And the problem is that human behavior is not logical.
No, and it never has been.
No. So the point is that when you start dealing, you start funneling people into a system that, on the face of it, is entirely logical. But if you press the wrong button, it doesn't work because you've not pressed the right button. It causes extraordinary responses in humans
Yes.
of anger and frustration. And of course, the undercurrent of this is that, we're dealing with problems with mental health anyway, aren't we? Not us personally.
No, but across the board.
Across the board. I mean,
there's a direct correlation, I think.
I think so. And you raised a point with me, which I thought was really interesting, that this is happening, obviously, in children's education.
Yes.
And we've got a situation where children are not being given the responsibility to do very simple tasks, such as take a letter home.
Correct.
To parents. Now, the point is, you could back that up with an email.
A general email across the class say, we have given your child a letter.
Exactly.
All they've got to say.
It's not just down to the fact that the child needs to take the email. The child doesn't even, the letter. The point is, the child doesn't need to know that there's an email.
No, because I remember as a child being given a letter, you are going on a school trip. If I didn't give that to my parents, I didn't go on a school trip.
So there was a motivation,
responsibility.
Right? Yeah. And there was a motivation for you to remember.
Exactly. There isn't any now.
No. And as I'm teaching children I've never seen so much obvious mental illness in children. I've never seen so much as I do now. I don't know, and it's not one factor. It's not, because obviously we want logically to go, it's because of so-and-so, because that's the part of the brain that unfortunately is causing the problem, right? It's our sort of desire to get the facts and sort it out. Unfortunately, it's more complex. And again, going back to the Rory Sutherland thing, and this is something that obviously you would have heard anyway. He cites an experiment done on dogs, where dogs are on two dogs, and they're in this sort of cage, and every now and again they got an electric shock. I don't know when this was done, but this is obviously animal welfare wouldn't like this.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
But one of the dogs could stop the electric shock by muzzling a button. And the one that didn't have that became very unwell because it had no way of controlling it. Right? And of course, you see that, don't you? When you lose your capacity to control your environment as a human being, it makes you very unwell. And that is the type of thing that goes on when you're stuck on a bloody phone for 2 hours waiting for somebody to give you a straight answer because you don't feel like you've got any agency in the matter anymore.
Well, that's really interesting because that's absolutely right. And it always has been. If you take a hierarchical business organization, if you like, so you got the guy at the top and the people right at the bottom, say, who are coming in the evening and cleaning, and people always say, oh, it must be terribly stressful to be the boss. Actually, it's more stressful being the person at the bottom because you have no control over what's happening to you. And immediately you haven't got any control, it becomes a stressful situation.
Yes.
And not having control is one of the worst things. And by distancing yourself from making decisions through a screen or a child bringing something home, they haven't got any control. They've got no purpose. It's losing their individual responsibility, which I'm sure is contributory to mental health.
Yes.
It's one of the components. I'm not saying it's all, but it's one of the components. You're removing their purpose. You're removing a purpose from something. We all need a purpose in life. I know when I retired, I thought, great. No, it wasn't. You need to wake up with a purpose. You need to have something tangible. And we're removing that from people. We're dealing with people at the end of a line you've got no relationship with. As I said, I went to the bank today. After everything had been completed, I shook the guy's hand, said thank you. How else can you do that? You don't have, and that's a human response. That's a tactile response, and we're losing all that capability, which is leading, I think, to the crisis in mental health.
Yes, so we've got situations where you can't go and see the same doctor.
If you can see one at all.
So you can't build a relationship with somebody as a GP where you can go in and speak to them and you know them. Because you'll see somebody else. Because they're not available, or you just, same thing with bank managers.
Yep.
Now, I don't know how long it will take because what's going on with this is this idea about streamlining. It's one of the most ridiculous bloody things, because the streamlining doesn't actually make things better. It just makes them more streamlined. What does that mean? It doesn't make it more efficient necessarily. Because again, you think about big fields, right? In agriculture. That makes them more efficient, and of course, until they lose their topsoil. And that analogy is like the same thing. We've obviously seen this with regard to like the guitar exams, right? Because it was being streamlined into the system of the other music exams, and it basically broke the system down. It broke it. So people were moving away, wanting to use other examination boards, because what made the thing work wasn't working anymore. But all the people at the university thought it was amazing. I mean, it's just utterly incredible. And again, this is what happens when you get lots of logical people sitting down, making logical decisions to fix a problem. It doesn't. It frequently does not fix it. In fact, it makes it worse in a different way.
Yes, it does. Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Now, I think because I've been saying to you about, obviously now this book is finally out.
Yes.
After all these years. And you were at the book launch the other day, which was really
good
fun, actually, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But really the point behind this thing is that creativity, enabling individuals to be creative in their own life, I think, is something that's of benefit. And that's might be my point about children learning how to just do crazy things, because that crazy thing for somebody might, if you get that in the right hands, okay, you might end up with an arch villain, but you might end up with a group of entrepreneurs doing amazing things. You might end up with somebody who can come up with an answer to a problem that we haven't been able to sort out, because we've not thought of it in a different way. And so that is sort of my mission.
Yeah.
Right?
And of course, for that to happen, you've got to be with the people. You've got to be with them, not through a screen, not through an app, not through a website.
No.
Got to be. And that's...
You've got... The thing about all of this is that once you've inspired people, and I mean, yeah, you can inspire people through books and screens and whatever, but the point about it is it's empowering people. So when you're dealing with what you've dealt with, you're not being empowered.
No.
Right. So we're back to the dog without the button to muscle, right? And it's absolutely crucial for us to have a feeling that we're part of something. Because as I said the other day, we're social creatures who just think we're individuals. And that's interesting because that actually says the problem is because we've got two sides of the brain, right? One of them thinks we're an individual. That's the logical part of the brain. It wants to break everything down into little boxes. And then we can think about ourselves. And then we got the other bit that actually's got the big picture, the social picture, the feeling thing that makes you feel good in a crowd, with a group of people that you're friends with, and all that sort of stuff, right? That stuff's not logical, is it? If you think about it,
No.
Being with a group of people and feeling happy about it is not logical. Okay, love is not logical. If you start expressing love in chemical reactions and whatever, you wouldn't get a partner.
No.
Being poetic, you would. And that just shows you that actually the intellect, the intellectual part of the brain is not good for our survival as a species.
No, it's the intangible parts that make it work.
Yes, ironically, it doesn't do good things. So, so I thought this was, this is a good conversation for people to think about the ways that they incorporate themselves into the world, about how important social connection is.
Yeah, I think it's really important.
Because one of those things is also about networking. So bring this back to the sort of Bluescamp aspect of things, because for those of you out there who don't know, we do. That's what we run.
Yes,
two of us. And obviously the whole thing about working as a musician is about networking. It always has been. And if you can't get on with other people, you can't survive as an artist. You get these stories of people who are sort of isolated characters, the Van Goghs and all the rest of it. He sold what, one picture?
I don't think he sold any.
He might not have sold any. No, exactly. Right. Well, that's, you don't want to aspire to as that.
No, you don't really, no.
Okay, he was a genius, but you don't want to aspire to that.
No.
You want to aspire to something where at least you can feed, your family. Or to do better than that,
Yeah.
And same with any form of art. But it's because those people look colourful that we tend to gravitate to those. And it's disproportionate. Right. So really you want to be the Eric Clapton of music and not the Syd Barrett. See, that's a really good example. A lot of people aspire to be Syd Barrett. But it would be better to aspire to somebody that could at least, for whatever reason, nothing about because he was a genius. But what I'm saying is, in ourselves, we've got to get that balance.
Yeah.
And part of that balance, although obviously a lot to do with this is an irony again. A lot of the problems with things with mental illness is sometimes to do with the way that the right side of the brain is working, right? Ironically, because if the left side of the brain has got everything down and it thinks it's got everything down, but it just doesn't seem to be right somehow. And there's a gnawing feeling that something is wrong, which is often what is underlying things like mental illness, right? You have the feeling that something doesn't quite fit. Is that sort of Neo thing in the Matrix?
Yes, yes,
That, you know,
yes.
there's that thing that you realize that something is not quite right. And the sort of is getting that sort of balance and the interplay between the two sides of the brain. It's like it's
Mm.
so important. But if you see society going in that way, where everything is predicated on this logical thing, where if something is a little bit weird, we don't want to deal with that because it's nonsense. Well, it isn't nonsense,
No, it's not at all.
right?
Yeah.
If somebody wants to believe that, they're getting ideas from a Martian, great. It didn't do David Bowie any harm, right? Whether that was just storytelling or what, it doesn't matter. But the point about it is like, we've got to just be able to embrace the fact that there are lots of people who can have a crazy idea, who within that crazy idea is something utterly brilliant.
Mm.
We shouldn't disregard. But again, this is another thing that we're doing, isn't it? This back projecting a revisionist history on people, taking them out of context and trying to show, valuing them as if they were here now. Right.
Yeah.
So, we're throwing out people with the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah.
The Winston Churchills and the whoever, just because it was outrageous that they thought like that. Well, that's how people thought then.
Yeah.
You might not like it, and it doesn't necessarily mean to say it was right, but for goodness sake, don't take people out of context.
No, and you can't expunge that from.
No, and not only that, it doesn't make us right either.
No, of course it doesn't.
Because in time, people will be looking back at us, and they will be thinking, "What a load of bloody idiots!"
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people think it now. I mean, you can just
exactly.
see,
Well, I was giving us a
bit of leeway,
a bit of slack, but
So
I think,
I think that coming back to the really basic of it, human interaction is a very basic need for human beings. You don't have to be extrovert. An extrovert person to have proper human interaction. In fact, some of the most sociable people are introverts.
Yeah.
In Western life, we don't celebrate introverts. We celebrate extroverts. And we forget. And then we start labeling some of these people, which is because in this society now, we have to have a label for everything. You've got ADHD, or you're autistic, or you're all because of this. No, I just don't want to do that, or I just do it in this way. Doesn't mean to say. So, and of course, if you label someone, you live up to that. You actually live up to it. So you're biting, you're creating the monster by doing it.
But it's interesting you say that, because we did this little I don't know what you would call it, sort of a creative evening a little while ago, didn't we, with a group of people?
Yeah.
And there were lots of people who were involved in the city and all the rest of it in the past lives. They'd sort of, I don't know what they were doing. Some of them had retired and whatever. But it was interesting that was something that came up a couple of times in conversation, because I mentioned this thing about, it's really dangerous. In one way, it's really good for people to know that there is something about them that makes them see the world in a particular way. But the danger is that once you've got the label, you become the label.
You become the label. And also the act of labeling gives them the impression they are not, in inverted commas, normal. Now, what's normal? Exactly. So you're actually, whereas a lot of these people are incredibly creative and incredibly interesting people, and they just do things in a different way.
Well, exactly, but that's
what's wrong with that?
You actually need people who are not normal, because normal in my mind just means boring, right? So, obviously, if we sort of reframe something, if something's normal, it's like, yeah, that's pretty boring and obvious. And if you're going to do anything interesting in life, you're not going to do it by doing it obvious, are you?
No, never.
Right? You've got to be able to see something that other people have not seen. That in itself is not normal. And it can be staring people in the face, but they have not seen it. And that always requires you to see the world differently to everyone else.
Anyway. Yeah, and that's what makes human beings work. That's how it works. And the problem is what we're doing now is distilling everything to the lowest common denominator.
Yes, exactly. Well, it's this idea that it's predicated in one way.
Yeah.
Because it needs to be streamlined. Here we go again, right?
Yeah.
So the point about that is, I've always been, as you know, I've always been interested in this concept of this sort of, shamanic thing of shape shifting, because, people think, oh, well, people didn't turn into a bird, but in their head they did. And of course, the interesting thing about that is that we have the capacity to see, because we are actually shapeshifters, because there are lots of skills that we have that don't come from a human being. So I must have told you this story about, African tribesmen who spear fish. And they learned that by studying birds who speared fish.
Yeah.
So they emulated the bird to do the thing. And if you look at Chinese martial arts, they're animals, right? You got the tiger form or the dragon form or whatever, or the frog or the drunk monkey. So what they're doing is embodying something about that creature that enables them to do. Now, we look at that and go, well, that's kung fu or whatever it is, right? But this is how we thought. This is how we thought. That's why people used to stick antlers on their heads and pretend they were communing. Well, they didn't pretend. They were communing with the deer or whatever it was, right? Yeah. To get an insight into the way that animal thought. And that makes sense because, again, you could go, well, is there this sort of mirror neuron thing going on? Because it certainly works in groups of humans because you end up with groupthink. If you spent enough time with a load of gorillas, would you start to think like a gorilla? And that's sort of more or less been proven by, whoever hung around with gorillas. What's her name? Can't think of the name. I can see it.
Yeah, I know you mean.
Can't think of the name. But we need to think more like that. We need to come at this sort of thing from a really left field creative aspect. So we have in the past with Bluescamp got people to think about being other musicians, haven't we?
Yes.
One of the things that we did. So, I think that's one of those things that's essential, that people need to be able to not realize that they're being sucked into a way of thinking by what's going on in society. And that no one has any skin in the game.
Yep.
But that needs to happen. That's something that Nassim Taleb, who's the writer about, he's sort of, well, he's not really an economist. He isn't an economist. I mean, he's a guy who made a lot of money in stocks and shares and all the rest of it, right? But he's a brilliant mind because he's not. He doesn't like economists, basically. But one of the points that he raised was that if you've got a situation where people do not suffer because of the decisions that they make.
Yes.
The decisions that they make can be catastrophic.
With no consequences to them.
With no consequences. But they are catastrophic because there are no consequences. And this happens with banking.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it happens in all sorts of things, doesn't it?
Yes.
And I just think things have a way. I mean, things have a way as a sinusoidal curve in human decades, that things come to a peak and things have to change. Otherwise, it's when are we going to see that realization? It's like, I mean, whittling it down to something really simple like newborn babies. You must sleep your baby on its front now. No, you mustn't. You must sleep it on its back now, 10 years later, because it's not right. They'll die. You can't leave them on the side. Well, sorry, where are you getting this information from? Well, this book says, but
right.
This person's never had children.
Exactly.
There's no consequence.
No, exactly. And this is one of the things that I get now. And I think this is becoming obvious to a lot of people, that things that are quoted as facts,
they're not.
They're not necessarily, right? And in fact, that's one of the things I put at the front of my book.
Yes.
Because I quoted Crowley's thing of a book of lies. Because in actual fact, ideas can stimulate new ideas. And sometimes, you cannot know where you got that information from. Have you seen it happen? So, but this is something that science doesn't like. Anecdotal evidence, right? It's anecdotal. Yeah, but that's how we got on. We've survived 2 million years on anecdotal information.
Of course, the other problem is when they say research says or it has been proved.
No, it hasn't.
No, it hasn't. Because you delve into that, they leave whole sections, because someone will always want to prove their hypothesis and use the research to prove what they thought, and not the other way around. And
there's a couple of things there, isn't there? Because apart from anything else, we get confirmation bias. Yes. So whenever you experience something, it backs up what you already believe.
Yes.
Right. And that happens in science. But the other thing is, of course, that because again, this is such a great metaphor. The intellect doesn't want to deal with complex things because it can't.
No.
So it's put into a lab. The lab is the perfect physical representation of what logic does. It isolates the thing and tests it. Now, we've obviously discovered a lot of amazing things and created a lot of amazing things because of that. But when you put them back into complexity, they often don't work, which takes me back to the Rory Sutherland thing, right? Now, the other side of the brain does complexity really well because it has to. But it's a sort of an ad hoc thing where you can't really work out why you should think that thing.
No.
So there's a couple of programs, a podcast that I listened to about social sciences, but used in business. And of course, a lot of these experiments where you do this and this happens type of thing is actually not necessarily true.
No, very rarely is.
Very, very rarely. And again, some of the research has been actually misrepresented. And some of the research has been actually fraudulently done in some cases. It's not actually when they wrote up the reports, they weren't true. Because they were backing up an idea that they were already testing, right? That they believed. So if we don't go back to our own experience about what we've seen, and what we've experienced, which is anecdotal, because we haven't done a scientific research into it, then we've got no agency over anything, have we?
No.
Right? Well, you end up with people doing stupid things because there's no proof that blah, blah, blah.
Or stupid things because the research says you can.
Yeah, well, let's face it, that's
That's the
how
problem.
people smoked for so long.
Yeah.
Because there was research being done by cigarette companies.
Yes. So it's a healthy, good thing for you.
God, that was the thing that was said. Right?
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, there's no evidence that it does this. You know, as everything started to fall apart, that's what they then did. And said there was no evidence. And as soon as the evidence started to sort of back up the thing that maybe it wasn't a good thing to smoke, or not to smoke the type of things that people were smoking, like cigarettes with filters on, with other chemicals in it and all the rest of it. Because again, as you experienced, if you go to Cuba, you might have a 103-year-old guy sitting out the back smoking a Havana cigar.
On his, all day long.
Exactly.
Now, put that in an experimental box.
Exactly. And he had an alligator in the back garden. Is that not right?
He did, yes. Yeah, pet alligator
exactly.
bath. Yeah.
So there we go.
And the other thing they do in between the cigars, they suck sugarcane.
Which is actually really good for you. Sugarcane is really good for you if it's raw.
It's raw.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what scientific experiment is happening there? Nothing. It's what people have learned. And I think, going back to kids at school, we're taking that away from them. We're taking that process of finding out and responsibility and being mindful that things have consequences if you do them.
Yes.
And we're taking that away from them. And that's a huge part of education, I think.
Yeah.
That we're absolving them from responsibility, and that's wrong.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And you've got to make your own way in the world. You've got to make decisions, and you've got to stand by your decisions, and then learn from your mistakes.
You have to have a framework. That's fine. Yeah. That's fine. The whole animal kingdom has frameworks. But not to have any framework and no responsibility is not in the human psyche, really. And that's why there are so many anxious, worried children.
Well, adults as well.
Yeah. Adults, yeah.
We've actually got to the point where this has been going on for so long that we've now got people who are parents who are now.
Yes.
And also it doesn't help them in the way that they feel that they're being watched all the time about how they're bringing up their children. Because and that doesn't stop child abuse either.
No.
I don't think, this idea that, the logical conclusion to that is that it would help stop child abuse, but it doesn't.
No, it doesn't at all. There's no.
Well, just in the same way that child protection policies in schools doesn't necessarily protect children either.
Yeah. I mean,
it stops people, being sued.
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying that these things are taken away, but I think the point is that it's a case of educating people about, what it is that we are as humans.
Yep.
And that's not just logical. It's also about social interaction and how we respond to one another and what is necessary and, what is necessary within society and all the rest of it. And, but also allowing people to have the flexibility to be different. And that is something which I've always said is not a good thing within education anyway, because then we've got a one-size-fits-all scenario.
No, it doesn't. It's just a nonsense. It's complete nonsense. I think, of course, the other thing, like you were saying, we all have to be registered in case we do this to a child or do that. When the pendulum swings totally one way or the other, that's where you get the problems, because there's no logical center road to it. I mean, these days, if you were to see a child fall over in the road, in the pavement, and they cut themselves, you can't go and pick them up, and you can't touch them, you can't help them.
No.
Because you will be arrested.
Well, technically speaking, yeah.
No,
but in actual fact,
I'm talking in the technical.
But that's what people think. You see,
people think that. So they're frightened of helping someone. As soon as you become tactile, that's assault, essentially.
Could be.
So we've lost all this great.
You've raised an interesting point, because there is this thing on the BBC. Steve Coogan's just done a thing about
yes.
Now, I've not seen it yet, but I will watch it.
Yeah.
The thing that fascinates me, and Steve Coogan, I saw an interview with Steve Coogan, and he spoke about how Savile used to communicate with people, where he used to do this sort of thing with his hands, like he was doing a magic trick.
Yes.
Well, there is a lot of stuff that when you listen to Savile, you can go, okay, NLP wasn't really about then.
No.
Well, it was, but it wasn't. People didn't know about it. It was something, little sort of weird thing going on in America, right? But he was using techniques that you would recognize as being some sort of communication skill. But the thing about Savile was the fact that the situation allowed that to happen. And it was an extreme situation in that period of time, which is another point, because it was sort of deemed okay for young girls to hang out with people as if it was par for the course, right? And we seem to forget that. We seem to forget that all of the pop stars and what have you had an entourage of young girls with them hanging around. And that was deemed to be okay.
Yeah.
And that was, this situation was an extreme. I'm not saying it's right.
No.
But socially, there was that going on. Just in the same way with Russell Brand.
Yes.
I don't like Russell Brand. He's not somebody I find interesting, particularly, right? At all. But he is going through a thing now of being Russell Brand, because he was always the same from what I can remember. I mean, my daughter went and saw him. Hannah went and saw him do a performance. And the first thing he did was he gave out his business cards to the prettiest girls in the audience with his telephone as part of the act. And the point was that the girls thought it was wonderful. Now, that type of, what we would have called a bounder, has always been something that people have thought was sort of quite amusing. The sort of Terry Thomas type of character, right? That type of person. And then we go through periods of time where that's not okay to be a rake.
Yes.
And then we get to a period of time where it's okay to be a rake. Be it the Earl of Rochester.
Yes.
And being forgiven because you were just an appalling social creature, but highly amusing. So we look at that and think, well, as you say, it's a pendulum.
It's a pendulum, yeah.
It goes backwards and forwards between this, and occasionally you get these sort of hideous characters like Savile appear that seem to be, or not just him, but also Rolf Harris.
Politicians, Cyril Smith, people like that.
Cyril Smith. There used to be... no, I won't go there.
Don't go there.
There was a joke was it Jeremy Thorpe joke?
Yes.
Who was next? It's Cyril Smith. was very large, wasn't it? Anyway, but yeah, so there's a lot of very strange things going on with us, I think, with humans.
But coming distilling it all down, what we do in Bluescamp and 440 Muses is actually try and we've seen it happen that you get a group of people together and they're all very different people. Some are introverts, some are autistic, they're blind. But when everyone gets together, when they're all there, they're all the same. It all becomes a self-embracing group that you can't explain to anybody unless they've done it.
Exactly.
They don't. The power of that, and we've lost all of that in society. We've lost.
Well, we seem to have done it because of the
a lot of it,
making it very difficult for that to
happen.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think in our small way, we do make it happen, and we are always amazed at the end of each year. We've been doing this 15 years. That how great that year was, and we always say that's the best year we've had. And of course, it was at that moment in time. Every year has been at that moment in time. And if you think back, we've had very, very few times where we thought this isn't quite right. Hardly anything. You will always. Sorry?
You learn from that because you look at those things and you think, right, okay, you can see what's going on in the dynamic within.
Yes.
Within things.
But what I was saying is everyone, whether normal, what we class as normal, felt wanted and part of the group, and didn't. There was no age. There's never the interesting. There's never any ageism either.
No,
at all. Absolutely none whatsoever. And I can't think of many other things that would actually happen in.
No,
it's quite a unique thing, and it's it's a template for how, if in a funny sort of way, how society used to work, because tribal groups didn't have ageism.
No,
you were part of that community, and you did things because you contributed. You learned off each other. You contributed. Okay, when you got too old, you walked into the forest to die, basically.
Well, I don't know about that, because I think what happens with that is that, it's a bit like old elephants, isn't it? They're the ones who remember where the water, where the wells are that haven't, dried up, because they can remember back to it happening before, and that's where the water was. And that's the thing about societies where you've got the elders. They've seen things happen before.
Oh, they're revered as well.
Yeah, they've seen things happen before, so they've got the perspective of time. And you see this, we see this with their grandkids, right? The things that your children are sort of worried about, you think, well, that's all right. Because it's all right. But to them, it's like,
it's the end of the world.
You say, well, no, because they'll grow out of it.
Yeah.
Right. And then there are other things that you see, you think, no, that's not good. Right. And that's obviously to do with the fact that you've had enough life experience to look at things and realize that you can't be definitively correct. That's the other thing as well, that that most things are unknowable, but there are certain patterns that seem recognizable. So cool stuff. All right then, mate. I think we've done
good.
Nearly an hour.
Yeah, I know. Time passes, doesn't it?
It does. Passes. Anyway, that's all good stuff. Anyway, we'll catch up with you soon, because in fact we'll have to do one of our French podcasts.
Yes, actually, that's a good idea. The beginning of November podcast, live from France, live from French Bluescamp with
Chris, wine and cheese.
Yes,
Chris's wine and cheese party. Right, yes, from the studio.
Excellent.
But that'd be good. we might be playing out there as well. Hopefully somewhere,
Yeah.
even just down at the patisserie.
Yes, indeed. Yes, or the pizza, or anywhere that
The
happens.
pizza restaurant.
Yes, that's right. Okay,
All right, mate. That's good.
cool.
I'll just turn off and then we'll
Okay.
chat before we go. Right?
Yep. Yep.
See you again.
Yep. Take care.